Hello and welcome everyone. I am Taflai and my guest today is Duke Burbridge. I hope I got that right. And he's a conflict analyst and he has 15 years of experience in conflict analysis and peace building in different places, including Yemen, South Asia, Middle East, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa. And he, for the past 2 years, has been really heavily involved in the Tigray war in terms of advocacy and underwriting and speaking up for Tigray. He has become pretty much part of the Tigrayan community. And this is a discussion that has been long in the planning. For one reason or another, we hadn't managed to hold it before. But today, I'm really excited to have you on, Duke. So welcome to Tighat channel.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
All right. So as we agreed off the record, I think we're going to mostly focus on humanitarian aspects, and then we're going to maybe delve a bit into peace building process, because that's also something that you would like to speak about. But I think our listeners would find it interesting if you could tell us a bit about your personal journey for the past 2 years, how you ended up, becoming pretty much part of the Tigrayan community. What was it like advocating for Tigray, becoming an integral member of our community, and that must have been some experience, and there will be people wondering how and why Duke is here. So please take us through that journey.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey into advocacy. I've never been an advocate, really a public advocate for anything. Most of my work has been in research, conflict analysis for community-based programs, meaning programs that are happening on the ground. So never public, never out in front, as they say. But in 2019, I was in Ethiopia to study interreligious tolerance and conflict that had happened over the past 10 years or so. And I went there around November 2019, October, November 2019, where there's a lot of optimism about what was happening in Ethiopia. People were sort of ignoring the issues that were happening in Oromia at the time that were very troubling, but less was known about the tactics that were being used there, at least on the international level, than what was known today, or what is known today. And I came back in February 2020 to resume a series of interviews I was doing, but of course COVID happened, and with the outbreak of COVID, I had to fly back to DC, and I was there. I had a project that was focused on Ethiopia, focused on conflict and religious tolerance, and so I had to keep my focus on Ethiopia, but it was paused. There was no way to do interviews. Most of my interviews were taking place with some of the oldest Muslims in Ethiopia. So rather than just obliterate the Islamic faith in Ethiopia by having these interviews face to face with people, I decided to pause the project. That went on for about a year. So I had to stay sort of glued to the television, glued to the internet, to watch the descent of the issue in Tigray into a horrible, brutal war that was focused more so than any other war that I had seen firsthand. It was focused on civilian population, which was something that immediately sort of grabbed me. In 2020, after I got back and I was working for a while, I sort of became disillusioned with peace building. I decided that I wanted to go in a different direction with my career. I was a little bit disillusioned with some of the methods that we used, building cohesion and promoting dialogue, and these sorts of things that we don't do in the United States. We don't do them very much in the West at all, but we're still trying to teach people to do them in other countries, particularly a place like Ethiopia that believe it or not, has a very rich history of dialogue and councils and talking about issues. And so I let all my contracts slide. I started being more public with my advocacy as I saw the government narrative being something that was unsustainable and inflexible. That if you say anything about the TPLF not being a terrorist or anything about the government's behavior in Tigray being, something other than a law enforcement operation, then you're automatically wrong. That sort of caught my attention. And so since then, I was I was supposed to be writing a book on reforming peace building, but that kind of I kind of put that aside to focus on the genocide that's happening in Tigray, that's being perpetrated by the Ethiopian government, the Eritrean government, by blocking humanitarian assistance, civilian massacres, weaponized rape. You have most of the background there, and that's been my focus ever since. Now, my experience with the Tigrayan diaspora, with the community and the other allies, that has been a wonderful experience. Of course, it's been mixed reception on my advocacy. The pro-government people, the accounts, the sort of genocide cheerleaders are very upset and they invent a lot of names to call you, but I don't give a shit at this point. I mean, it's something that if I was younger, I would care more about, I'm sure. But at this point, what am I going to do? But am I going to stop advocating for an end to a genocide because somebody calls me a racist or a grifter? So it's been an interesting journey, a rewarding journey, an interesting journey, and hopefully productive. But I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's the prevalent culture now in Ethiopia is a very crude binary thinking. You are either from regime or you are against the country, and that's pretty much it. There is no even pretense to be any more nuanced than that. So the name calling and the personal attacks and smear that you will have been subjected to don't surprise me. It surprised me in the slightest. I think everybody has been a victim of that. But I think, if anything, you should check that as a badge of honor, really.
I do.
And so I think for some listeners who might not be entirely in tune with the context of Ethiopia, you said that you were in Ethiopia in 2019, and that was a couple of months before the war started, and it was the dynamic of the politics and everything wasn't really healthy then. The heat was kind of bubbling up underneath, and for any kind of close and astute observer, it was kind of obvious to see what was coming. The writing was on the wall. What was your sense of the country then, of the politics, of the people, interactions with with kind of ordinary people that you would have had in the capital city, and you would have gauged the general situation of the country? And what was your, insofar as you could recall now, what was your sense then?
Well, there was a sense of profound distrust in the direction. When I spoke to people in the West, diplomats or State Department staffers, they were much more excited about what was happening in Ethiopia than the people that I was talking to in Ethiopia. I remember, so it was after Abiy had won the Nobel Prize, saying, "Oh, you won! This is a wonderful thing. You got the Nobel Prize," and everybody was like, "Well, let's hold on to the praise." Even at that point. Now, it has to be understood that I was most of my conversations, most of my engagement was with a specific population segment, was primarily with Ethiopian Muslims, most of them in Oromia, in other parts of the country. So it was not, this may not have been reflective of the general population. There may have been different feelings, but some of the initial enthusiasm had started to wear off by October when I was there the first time. When I was there the second time, things had really started to shift as far as attitudes, particularly towards Abiy and this sort of cult of personality that he had put together. There were concerns that he wasn't doing enough, that he was, not going to be fulfilling these reforms, these promises that he had made. And there's a little bit of agitation, and that's interesting that that persisted up until the war broke out with Tigray, which a lot of those complaints, a lot of those concerns sort of got washed under by this perceived threat from Tigray, from the TDF or TPLF, whichever, and they that sort of atmosphere changed quite a bit after the war started. But it was when I was there, I always think that it was an amazing time to be there. I'm very thankful that I was in Ethiopia in late 2019, where people were still talking about the future. I mean, it's interesting because I was meeting with Pan-African groups that were talking about regional integration and greater, continental integration, and seeing Ethiopia as an example for others to follow, because it was still a great success story at that time. When I came back the second time, there was a lot less of that. It seemed like everybody knew a secret that maybe people in the West didn't know yet. And I guess that's the best way I can frame it.
Yes. So to segue into our topic for today, Duke, we said that we're going to talk about humanitarian workers and humanitarian organizations in Ethiopia and how they have operated, and what your observations and your grievances are. You have been following them very, very closely. And I know that you have been writing a lot about what you think they should do better and what you think they were doing wrong. And I would want us to go into those details. But I think it would be advisable to start with very abstract terms. What do you think is it that the one thing that you think they have got wrong in terms of how they have operated, in terms of their approach, in terms of how they have tried to understand the humanitarian catastrophe in Tigray? What is the one area or domain that you believe they are in the wrong?
If I had to put it to one primary area, one a noteworthy mistake that I think it continues to be made by humanitarian agencies operating in Tigray, in Ethiopia for the most part, it is the sort of subservience to the government that they've sort of assumed. There is, there is always going to be this back and forth, this power struggle between humanitarian groups and any government that's not overwhelmingly enthusiastic about having people provide food or provide medicine or whatever the groups are providing. With a government like Ethiopia, where humanitarian workers began demonized since day one of the conflict, there was a different approach that they could have taken that would have held fast to objective reality, to facts, to truth. Taking a hard line on, of course, as you see, when there's a interview with a humanitarian official, the government comes out and says, here's what everybody said in the interview, and they try to control the narrative that way. That sort of thing is not unusual. It happens. They try to avoid letting that happen, but it still happens. But the important thing is that gets separated from reality, that a humanitarian organization is not then making decisions based on unconfirmed information that they're getting from the government. So they have to maintain that sense of independence and authority to where they have a job to deliver humanitarian assistance to people in need, and that's objective number one. that there's nothing that goes beyond that, and that anything that endangers that objective becomes something that they have to be inflexible about, that they can't bend, that they can't negotiate, that they have to be inflexible. Either we're going to be allowed to deliver food to starving families who need it, or we're having this discussion at a higher level. There needs to be leadership needs to come and back them up. The UN needs to come and back them up. If the leadership of the humanitarian organizations can't do so, it needs to go up to the top as far as it has to make sure that either these permissions are allowed to deliver food and other necessary services, or that is the entire agenda of negotiations. Is, we could talk about your thing, we could talk about national dialogue, we could talk about peace after we talk about how do we get this food or these things that people need to survive. How do we get this to people in need? That should, I think that should have been the objective, a clear objection from the humanitarian organizations, which on the level of humanitarian workers in Tigray, that appears to be the objective. They're dealing with very difficult, very dangerous circumstances and doing a wonderful job. When it comes to leadership, even leadership in Addis Ababa, even before you get to the senior leadership, that's where where you start to see people sort of peeling off from the objective, from the mission, which is, to deliver aid. That's, I think, where they got into a lot of their problems.
So yeah, so if you say that the one overarching problem is that they have been subservient to the Ethiopian regime, and I don't disagree with that. The natural follow-up question would be why? Were they always going to be subservient by design because of the circumstances, because of how humanitarian workers are supposed to work, or were there other variables? And I'm going to suggest some points, and you're going to explore them further. So one major point that an ex-minister in the government, I think her name is Filsan. She has since resigned, and she's now abroad, I believe, in exile. She said that a lot of the UN staffers in Addis were in some sort of quid pro quo arrangement with the government. So they would do some sort of favor for the government, and then so subservience, in your word, and then they would get access to some exclusive clubs and other sorts of kind of perks and benefits. So there has been that sort of grubby deal with the regime. I think that's one reason. There is another thing that happened almost 2 years ago that was really, really shocking to me, and that was when about 12 UN staffers in Addis disagreed with the regime, and the regime mercilessly expelled them, and no one came to their defense, no one from the UN. And I think that could have set the tone for how other humanitarian workers were going to be treated in Ethiopia. They either have had to be subservient, or they were going to be expelled. And that's what I mean if the system has let them down, and the only option they have had was to be subservient. So how much of their subservience do you attribute to the grubby deal that I mentioned, and how much of it do you attribute to there being a kind of a systemic design flaw in the way that the UN and the humanitarian workers operate?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, the open letter from the former minister, I believe, of women and I'm sorry, I don't remember her full title, but yeah, the former minister had made an accusation of luxury vacations and stuff for UN staffers, which, if that happened, that absolutely shouldn't have. And then in around late September, I think it was, that the Anthony Guterres had said that there's a de facto blockade in Tigray. The outgoing humanitarian chief had mentioned a lot of interference by the Ethiopian government. Now, the incoming humanitarian chief, Martin Griffith, had given an interview, a couple of interviews, saying there's been, there's still this blockade on Tigray. The fault rests with the government. And after that, they expelled most of the senior staff. And Antonio Gutierrez, he said this is illegal. They held an emergency session. He used his right of appeal or right of response in the session to tell people, to demand proof, evidence of being notified about some of these transgressions, and that didn't happen. And then they just sort of folded. They needed high-level support to ensure that the UN, the mission of the UN was respected. I mean, the idea of respecting the UN, I don't, that's a little personal, but the mission of the UN to deliver humanitarian assistance to people who need it, that needed to be protected. And there was nobody who was willing to step up to protect that. From Antonio Gutierrez to the U.S. representative, to the EU representative, nobody was willing to go to bat to keep these people in. And you saw about in the same month, about 70 drivers were arrested in the mass arrests of Tigrayans in the capital, and another 12 or 13 staffers were arrested after that, along with some of their dependents. And were held in, and nobody knew if they were arrested for being Tigrayan or if they were arrested for being a part of the UN. But this sort of coercive attitude continued by the Ethiopian government. And so there is that. It's almost like you see the carrot and the stick with the Ethiopian government and the UN. There should have been an investigation of the UN in Addis Ababa, not just for that accusation that the former minister made, also for some of the statements that were made by members of the UN in Addis. If you recall, the leaked audio of Tigray is too dirty to go back to, or something, and casually dismissing some very well-documented rape accusations that were happening at the time. All of these things demanded an investigation. They should have gotten to the bottom of that. But unfortunately, in the humanitarian space and in the peace-building space, where I have more experience, there's not so much oversight. I think they still have this perception, this mentality of beggars can't be choosers. So if we get some food out there, then we're doing our job. However we have to do it is fine. And that absolutely cannot be the mentality anymore. They have to recognize that they have an obligation to the people that they serve. These people aren't begging. There are no such thing as beggars. There are human beings, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, children, who may not have the capacity to get their own food at this moment. But there's no such thing as somebody who's out of options. They need to treat people with respect. And part of that happens when it comes to going to bat for humanitarian assistance to be able to get into the area that they're in.
So you say that when the humanitarian workers were attacked and harassed, they should have received protection from higher-ups, and the kind of attack and the kind of harassment that they have been subjected to is actually extraordinary. I think starting from the murder of 3 ICRC workers in Tigray, but it was later confirmed that the murder was perpetrated by Ethiopian forces, to the expulsion of UN workers, to other countless examples that we could mention. No one has paid any price in Ethiopia. No one was held to account. Not only was no one not held to account, but also even in terms of public support, nothing has been forthcoming from the UN or from the ICRC. In fact, in the most bizarre development, an ICRC higher-up official went to Addis a couple of weeks ago and praised the Ethiopian government for its what was the wording, for its professionalism in dealing with humanitarian workers. The exact opposite of the one word that you would never use with the Ethiopian regime is professionalism when it comes to humanitarian workers. But that is the kind of treatment, that's the kind of coddling that it has been receiving. And it can't have been lost that this is a regime that has been murdering and harassing their own staffers. So surely there are variables, there are considerations that 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 they are taking into account. There is a political thinking to kind of that is dictating them to behave in this way, to coddle the Ethiopian regime and to let it off of any responsibility. And I can't quite figure out what that political thinking might be in terms of the humanitarian workers. For instance, what is the ICRC trying to achieve in Ethiopia by pretending that its staffers have never been murdered? What is the UN trying to achieve in Ethiopia by pretending that its staffers haven't been expelled from Ethiopia? I can't understand what that political thinking is really. And so I wonder if this is something unprecedented, or if this is how the UN and ICRC and WFP have always behaved and operated in other countries as well. They looked away at their staffers had been killed and murdered and expelled and harassed, or if this is kind of new development that really perplexes you in the way that it does me. So yeah, explore that
Yeah.
line of thinking.
It's not. I'm not sure if it's unprecedented. It's definitely a different approach than has been done in the past. I don't know if they've ever handled it that way. I believe that the three workers that you're talking about were staffers with Doctors Without Borders. They were traveling, and according to the New York Times report, they were shot. They were executed on orders by the Ethiopian government. This was the New York Times story, what they were able to determine. And when they came back, they were not, the president of the organization was not allowed to even meet with Abiy, and there's been no investigation since then of what's happened. Then they were kicked out of the country about a month after that happened for carrying satellite phones. This was the accusation, was that this group that had recently lost 3 staff members in Tigray were then expelled from the country. So their entire operations were suspended for a number of months because they were found to be carrying sat phones, which they desperately needed to have communication in that situation where they had no protection. But it reminds me of in Kenya a number of years ago, probably a decade ago, in Dadaab, in the refugee camp, a number of Doctors Without Borders staffers were kidnapped by al-Shabaab. That precipitated, I won't say that caused, because it's easy to get simplistic, but that precipitated an incursion into Somalia by Kenya that to respond to this egregious targeting of humanitarian workers. This is just 10 years ago. Now that did not work out particularly well for Kenya, and in the end, that created a significant backlash that was maybe, to just invade a country because of this was maybe not the right thing to do. But I've never seen, I hate to say it, but almost shaking off something like humanitarian workers being killed. There was a humanitarian worker killed just a few months ago while they were distributing food in Shire. This is unconscionable that this would happen, and that it would sort of pass by the leadership. Nobody would stand up to say something about this. Now, the political calculus to this, I believe, is that there are 130 million people in Ethiopia. A significant amount of people need food, need urgent humanitarian assistance, particularly with the drought coming. I think that you'll probably find that I don't want to try to speak for them, but you'll probably find some leadership saying, if we object to what the government's doing, then all of the distribution will stop. They'll kick us out, and we will not be able to serve people in the Somali region who need food. We won't be able to serve people in the Oromia region who need food. And so to stay in the country, we have to, carry this bizarre party line. I think that's a mistake. But at this point, you have to wonder, would somebody back them up? If the country director from the UN, from UN OCHA said, no, I'm not going to do it. They've gone too far. They've killed humanitarian workers. We don't allow this. I don't care what senior leadership is saying. I have to say something. I feel an obligation. If that person would be backed up by their own leadership, and then in turn, if that leadership would be backed up by somebody in the international community, somebody on the Security Council, somebody who has some kind of influence to make things happen in Ethiopia with the Ethiopian government, I'm not sure if that would happen. So it's a delicate situation. There are nuances, but it feels like there's a lack of a conflict-sensitive approach that's happening with humanitarian organizations, where they're acting as if things are sort of business as usual, without understanding, without adapting to the fact that this is a conflict, that there is a hostile presence of an entity that is against humanitarian aid. They act like everybody's in favor of humanitarian aid. There's just a conflict right now, which is not accurate. And I think that the inability to see that is very difficult for them. But I do understand that they're trying to stay in the country. They're trying to make sure that they can still distribute humanitarian aid to people who need it. This is an area where we spend, I think, more than $1 billion a year, the United States, in providing aid to Ethiopia. I think they're trying to maintain that relationship, but they need to have top cover, some higher level support, which isn't happening.
Well, I think that's a very plausible or even likely explanation, that they accepted Tigray as the sacrificial lamb to operate in other parts of Ethiopia. I think that is what happened, and I think that would explain a lot of the otherwise complicity of the humanitarian workers. And I think maybe that would explain also why Samantha Power, despite what she had written before in her book titled, I think, The Problem from Hell, in there she expounds about how different UN officials have historically become complicit in different atrocities in Africa. Why they were kind of trying to do the right thing in their own mind, but actually the way they were going about, by agreeing to work with the host government, like with the Ethiopian government, for instance, how they were falling into the trap of being used as weapons. So she writes at length, and she warns of people from falling into that trick. And to see she herself committing the same kind of mistake that she accused other US officials had committed in the case of Rwanda and other places, it had been one of the most difficult things for me to understand. But maybe what you're saying makes sense, even in her case. Maybe she accepted Tigray, all right, there's nothing much that I could do in terms of Tigray, but by causing up to the regime, at the very least, I'm going to save people in Somalia. Maybe that could be part of the explanation, maybe not the entirety, but at the very least, it could be a factor in her thinking, because otherwise it's unconscionable how she has been behaving. Again, I don't want us to single out any individual, but I think given the position that she has and given the kind of image that she has, I think it's worth kind of talking at length about how she has operated and why she has been in a fundamental way wrong. So I would like to hear what your assessment of her and of WFP General. I think in the case of WFP and the Director General is beyond the pale, actually, in that case.
Yeah.
But anyways, please, a few words there.
Yeah, I mean, Samantha Power, unfortunately, has become sort of the villain of her own book, so to speak. Every day, she describes people who have become complicit, people who, you know, as you said, with the right intentions, have become cogs in the machine that are sort of grinding people up. And you know, it's interesting because she was very, very outspoken. She has a limited amount of power as the administrator of USAID. She has no army. She has no ability to break a blockade or something like that. She has the pulpit. She can talk about these things. She can speak, you know, frankly and honestly. about what's going on, and she did for a while. During this time, during the period between, let's say, July and August, or I'm sorry, July and September and October of 2021, when there was when the sort of blockade had been set after the forces withdrew from most of Tigray, she was outspoken. She was saying, the government is blocking food. We have full warehouses that aren't able to get into Tigray. This is unacceptable. And she was saying those things, but there was no action. There was no. I mean, in her case, this would have been her pushing Secretary of State or the president to get involved, to say, to influence Ethiopia to allow food assistance to get into Tigray. However, she's gone silent since the peace process has sort of ramped up and we've gotten into like the negotiations. I think the last time she had a very forceful comment about it was back in May, when after they said that they had opened the blockade, and only about 177 trucks got in the first month, which is appalling because it started on the first day of the first month. Once that happened, she was very forceful in a House hearing about what was happening in Tigray. But since then, it's been silence, and in some cases, it's been worse than silence. I think her last interaction was almost supportive of the Ethiopian government. But that is the line I think that people are crossing that shouldn't be crossed. It's unconscionable. It's unconscionable either way. If they are if they are neglecting Tigray for some other reason, that's unconscionable. Even if they're neglecting Tigray as a means to serve other areas of Ethiopia, you may be able to make the argument that that's absolutely what should happen to make sure that people get food, but it's still unconscionable. It's still something that should keep you up at night. But the line that has been crossed is that if you have to be subservient, if you have to be silent, if you have to be deferential to the government narrative, that's understandable in many cases. In international relations, that happens. But then to lie about things, to include bad data, to parrot, I think we've seen American politicians come back parroting, these stories about stolen trucks and all of these other, sort of more outlandish conspiracy theories as to why aid isn't getting in. That's where the line, those are lines that should never be crossed. You never have to promote a false narrative about humanitarian assistance in order to keep access. Once you do that, it's very hard to say that you're doing more good than harm in that situation, because that goes beyond not delivering aid or allowing a blockade to continue. That goes into intentionally misleading the world about what's happening in Tigray, which the impact of that is you're not able to really see how far that impact can go. And I think that that's been an issue with Tigray, is that the world has been misinformed by so many people that were supposed to be trustworthy as far as humanitarian assistance goes, as far as telling the story about what the conditions were in the places that they serve. That has, I think, significantly damaged the humanitarian response in Tigray in ways that they possibly didn't intend.
Well, yes, I think they were misused, I should say, their positions to misinform and disinform, and actually that's the textbook example of using one's position to cause harm, the one thing that any humanitarian worker shouldn't do. But I think we sort of understand why political or humanitarian workers with political agenda, or who have entered into some sort of quid pro quo arrangement with the regime, as we said earlier, we kind of understand why they behaved in the way that they have. But it's not only those humanitarian workers who have really fouled in Ethiopia. It's also good faith humanitarian workers who really, really tried to do their work in the most professional way. And I think the one that comes to mind is Mark Loco, who resigned towards the end of 2020 or early 2021. I can't be quite sure.
2021, yeah.
Yeah, and we don't quite know why he resigned, but I wouldn't be surprised if he resigned because he was really frustrated with the way things were. So I think that tells us that even good faith humanitarian workers could do only so much. There was a lot of restrictions, a lot of limits in what they could do. And I think that points us to some structural problem and design flaw in the way that humanitarian workers operate. And I tried to mention that in off the record discussion. The problem that I see is that humanitarian workers have to get the consent of the host country. If the host country doesn't want them to do things in a certain way, they can't, because they would be accused of, interfering in internal affairs. They could be accused of supporting rebel forces and a lot of other things, and their work becomes extremely difficult. So do you envisage any sort of design change, any sort of structural change in the way humanitarian workers should operate, so that they will be able to transcend and steer clear of local politics of the host country? If there is anything that you could in principle think of.
Yeah, it's hard to see that happening. It's something that absolutely needs to happen, and not just in Tigray, not just in Ethiopia. This is with world hunger increasing right now through issues. Some of it has to do with climate change. Some of it has to do with some natural conditions. Some of it has to do with conflict. But as this is, I think, going to be a more attractive method of war to a lot of authoritarian regimes, this is going to come up more in the future than it already has. And it is hard to see how they're going to adapt to it, how the humanitarian agencies are going to adapt to that. Because if you look at the top, at the UN, the Department of State, you see this new sort of theme of quiet diplomacy being the way that we do business. It's see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. All diplomacy is quiet unless it's public diplomacy. That's a given. But when they say quiet diplomacy, what they mean is that they'll stay quiet about horrible things that are happening. This is something that Antonio Guterres is sort of known. This is sort of his doctrine. There's been articles written about him not being more forceful about human rights, about fundamental things like humanitarian assistance or false imprisonment or violence. There are the sort of doctrine that he's laid out that I believe Anthony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, has sort of embraced. It stops you from being too far out there to be to be criticized. The United States can always hide behind the African Union, let's say, in these peace negotiations. If anything went wrong in the peace negotiations, trust me, this would be the African Union's fault from the perspective of the Americans or the UN. They have somebody they can blame for that. This is a similar thing happened in Yemen, where they turned over the transition to the GCC. That was Gulf solutions for Gulf problems, I guess. And it went horribly. And after a year of national dialogue where it didn't, nobody knew if it was ever going to end, while the people of Yemen were starving, it fell apart. And the national dialogue didn't create the descent into absolute, a multi-sided civil war, but it certainly helped that happen. It was an off-ramp that was missed as far as the conflict goes. In Ethiopia, in probably throughout more of Africa, the African Union will be set up as a place to it's a buffer. It's something that there's not going to be much progress made by the African Union. They seem extremely disinterested in protecting the rights of civilians in Tigray, despite their charter. but it's something that can protect Western policymakers, diplomats from being seen as being negligent. Because of course, at this point, we're doing what they want. We're saying African solutions for African problems, no matter how bad those solutions are, no matter how many Africans are killed by those solutions, we can at least say, hey, don't look at us. You know, this was the African Union who did it. And so with those factors involved, with those easy sort of refuge from criticism or blame for them to lean on, it's hard to see positive change happening. But it will have to happen at some time. It's just how many people are going to starve, how many people are going to sit behind blockades, not only in Ethiopia, but I believe that this is going to be a more popular tactic moving forward. How many people are going to have to starve before they realize that there needs to be a sea change in the humanitarian organizations and in the higher level power structure that supports them? But to do that, the humanitarian organizations need to make sure that they are doing the right thing, that they're not parroting disinformation, a bad narrative, that they aren't, you know, the World Food Program right now, you had mentioned David Beasley. There's a real concern right now that the World Food Program is not sending food, the significant amount of food into the Northwest Zone, which is one of the two zones that they are supposed to be operating in, because they're accepting the government's reports of, you know, there's been a number of people been fed in one-off food distribution in Shire and Shiraro, up, you know, further north. It appears that they're accepting that at face value, not considering the fact that the government they're talking about has credible accusations of weaponized starvation, has been lying for the past 2 years, and that they're actually not sending food into the Northwest province or the Northwest Zone because they're accepting that information. That's when that has to change. That's when you know, it's not you don't necessarily go on TV every time the government says something and say, no, that didn't happen. There's no food being distributed there. But you certainly don't factor that into your logistics planning, which appears to be what's happening. So at this point, we seem to be so far in a bad direction that it's hard to see how to move forward without a significant change at the highest levels, which sounds like the easiest thing to do, but is often in the capitals of the great cities the hardest thing to have happen. So it's difficult to see. It's difficult to see.
It's difficult to see. Yes, I can see. I can see. Another problem that I sense, and maybe my assessment could be wrong, so you'll kind of fine tune my view here, Duke. But another problem that I see from distance is in the way that local branches of humanitarian offices are staffed. They are generally staffed by local people, and in normal times, this may not be a problem. But in situations like Ethiopia, where there are entrenched political views, where the people, the local people who work for the UN or for the humanitarian organizations have their own very strong views. So for instance, in the case of Ethiopia, almost everybody who was employed in the local UN or the other branches had strong anti-Tigray views, because anti-Tigray view was kind of normalized, and Tigrayans who might have been employed by any of these organizations have been sacked, have been expelled from their positions. So even though they would be speaking in the name of the organizations they work for, actually they have their own political views, and they have incentives to misrepresent and to want to parrot the government line. You repeatedly used that phrase, parroting the government's line. I see that as a very, very fundamental problem. How do you address the human element problem of that is really, really evident in the case of Ethiopia, especially?
Yeah, that's very challenging. I mean, in Ethiopia was the first time, I think probably in the history of the world, that the former Nobel Peace Prize laureate sent police to the offices of the current Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the World Food Program, to inquire as to the Tigrayan workers who lived there. This was in the early days of the invasion of Tigray. This is, and once you can purge a staff, which it becomes murky what happened after that. If they did fire the Tigrayians, if there were some still working there, but once that happens, then the government essentially controls that office. If you are now in a society, which it wasn't in 2019, there was dissent, but in 2020 there was a remarkable lack of dissent that was sort of enforced by the government. And if they can fill the staff with their partisans, then you have a very difficult situation, and it's one that international NGOs struggle to deal with. Is that there's sort of a it's almost a scam the way they deal with local communities. And I'm not saying this specifically at the UN. I'm talking about international NGOs as a whole, where they say, we have local buy-in, or we are working with the local community or local actors. And what that usually means is that we're working with people in the capital of this country who speak English. That's generally what they mean by local actors. And they don't necessarily have a great perspective on what people in their own country who are not in the capital, are not a member of that, that bubble society that they have. This happens in the United States as well. If we drive 2 hours outside Washington, D.C., you'll find people who thought we had a socialist president who smoked cigarettes or whatever. So you find that in every country, but to see how that impacts the humanitarian distribution and the ability to achieve the mission of humanitarian agencies is something that is very challenging. And there needs to be conflict sensitivity. When you have a conflict, you need to understand the contours of the conflict, and you need to understand where are good sources of information and where are bad. If you see somebody from the Tigrayan regional or the former Tigray regional government at this point, if you see somebody from the TPLF saying no food has come into Tigray, you understand that they're coming from a certain perspective. So that would have to be confirmed. If it's just them and everybody else is saying food's coming in. If you see somebody in Addis who is perhaps a partisan of the Prosperity Party saying a bunch of food has gone in, I don't care if they're from the UN, I don't care who they're with, you do need to verify that information, because you've seen instances of misinformation, disinformation coming out, and poor decision making coming out from that. So there needs to be they need to stay on top of it more. When 70 drivers get arrested, when half of your staff gets arrested by the government, you need to understand that this is, not only is it a very delicate, very sensitive situation, but it's also an environment where you have to stay on top of what the contours of the disagreements, of the political disagreements are, to understand who is maybe acting unprofessionally. Because at the end of the day, this is unprofessional. It's unprofessional to be distributing aid and be influenced by the government or any entity that isn't also in distribute aid. To have those sort of distractions, to have those biases, is something that's not, it should not be allowed in humanitarian assistance, and it needs to be addressed where it exists, because there are humanitarian groups that are partisan. There's, it's surprising that the political party, that the Prosperity Party doesn't itself have a dedicated humanitarian. If we were in other countries, that would happen. But there are partisan humanitarian groups. The UN is not supposed to be one of those. The World Food Program is absolutely not supposed to be one of those. And so there needs to be a greater awareness of what's happening on the ground, I think.
Well, yes, I think you would expect the humanitarian organizations to have basic check mechanism, especially given that the regime, both the Tigrayans and the Ethiopian regime, are known for inflating numbers, for sometimes outright lies, and this is a established thing. And to counter that, you would expect them to do basic verification and check, but they have failed to do that. And it's always surprising. Nothing in Ethiopia has been normal the past 2 years. Duke, I mean, so far, I think we kind of focus on very abstract concepts about how the humanitarians work, how they ought to work, what change they should introduce structurally, and all those aspects, which I think are very, very important. If by any chance any humanitarian worker is listening to us, I think they will find some of the things that you said very constructive. But in practical terms, as we speak, people are starving now in Tigray, as we know. And even the aid that is trickling in, if you have been closely paying attention, and you will have been closely paying attention, I know you do that, most of the aid has been going to Western Tigray. And that's for a reason, because they control, by they, I mean the two regimes, the Eritrean and the Ethiopian regimes, control distribution and everything. And there is every chance, for instance, to believe that the aid that goes to Western Tigray could potentially be being distributed to Eritreans, for instance, and nothing could actually be getting to the actually starving people of Tigray. But the humanitarian workers don't want to go into this sort of nuance. So, for instance, there's a difference between delivering aid to central Tigray, the areas controlled by Tigrayan forces, and the areas controlled by the foreign forces. There's a difference because we know how the distribution will be handled. But I would like to ask you what you think they should do to solve that problem, to actually make sure that the aid gets delivered to the people most in need.
Well, there's absolutely no reason why a parallel system of aid distribution needed to be set up in Tigray following the peace process. There was a aid distribution system that worked as well as it was allowed to due to a lot of the restrictions placed on by the government. But in the aid distribution in Tigray should be handled by international aid organizations. This is not to say that in every country, local aid groups should not be used. In this case of Tigray, the Ethiopian government should not ever be the only source of information, should not be distributing aid in an area that they have been credibly accused of attempting to starve into submission for the past 2 years. There are real concerns, not only that humanitarian assistance could be diverted to soldiers, whether they be Ethiopian soldiers or Eritrean soldiers. There were a lot of soldiers in Tigray, a place that did not have a great deal of food, so there had to be a lot of food going in for those soldiers. Was the humanitarian assistance diverted to those soldiers or not? We don't specifically know. Also, is humanitarian assistance being given only to people who are in favor of the government, who are willing to be in favor of the government? These are questions that don't get asked. No matter what people say about humanitarian assistance coming from international aid organizations, they don't ever have an obligation to support the group. You can walk right up and say, I hate the United States, and you can still get a bag of grain with the US flag on it. That's how they operate. It's not perfect, but that's how they operate. So all of the aid should be distributed through impartial actors, which happen to be even when I say that, when we think about the World Food Program, there are questions about impartiality with the leadership of the World Food Program. However, we still know, I still very much believe in the case that if the World Food Program says this truck got into Tigray, then this truck got into Tigray. Now, when they say this food has been distributed, if they mean this food has been delivered to Shire for the government then to distribute, there's real questions about whether that actually got to the people in need. I mean, the questions that you want to ask are, are the people at greatest need getting the food? The questions, the secondary questions, the questions that never should be asked, but sometimes have to be asked, is food being withheld for political reasons? Is food being withheld even for worse reasons than that? But we're at a state where if this food is delivered to the government. Those are the questions that have to be answered. And these are things that need to be verified. It's not just questions. It's how can you verify that they're not doing this? Because that has been the theme for the past 2 years. If you don't accept the government, if you don't accept the authority of a government that was never elected in Tigray, by the way, if you don't accept their authority, you don't get food. That's been the theme. So without acknowledging that that's over, without acknowledging that that was the theme and now it's not the theme anymore, there's no reason to believe that that's no longer the theme. So to deliver humanitarian aid to the government to distribute is not a worthwhile premise right now. But if they can be distributing aid, if World Food Program partners on the ground, which it's not just the World Food Program with people flying in from it's a lot of this are local organizations, and there's probably 20 partners that are distributing food. Many of them are international organizations. There needs to be organizations without a partisan lens, without a bias, distributing food as intended. That's what needs to happen, and they need to say if it's not happening. That's another I think important thing.
Yes, well, they are all important details, Duke. So we planned to go for 40 minutes, and we have actually hit the 1 hour mark. So that was how interesting the conversation was, and I hope our listeners will find it educational and informative. And I would like to thank you for the time now, but also for the work that you do using your platform, whether that is Twitter, and also I know that you do the great work with UMD Media. That's also very, very appreciated, and we recognize that. And I know that you don't, work to be appreciated and recognized. You do that because you believe it's important to do that, but that doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge and appreciate and recognize what you're doing, and that's something that I would like to express. And I know that you would also like to speak about peace building, and also there are a lot of details in terms of the humanitarian aspect that we could go into. So I will hope that we will have another chance of a conversation. But for today, I am really, really grateful for your time, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be on the program, and yeah, God bless the people of Tigray. I hope that this horrible, horrible situation can be over soon. It's been way too long. Thank you so much.
Thank you.